So Tony, moving on to the JAMA paper. So this paper describes a closed-door meeting with the FDA in March 2004. You walked in and told a federal regulator that simulation should be part of how physicians are approved to perform a procedure. Who was in the room that day?
The meeting with the FDA in 2004 was closed door because the FDA were still trying to work out the position they should adopt for the approval of carotid artery stenting with embolic protection. The issue that they had was there was three separate groups or disciplines within medicine wanting to perform this procedure. There was the interventional cardiologist who had significant catheter wire experience in doing procedures in and around the coronaries, but they had no experience of working in the carotids. We had the vascular surgeons who had significant experience of carotid artery surgery, but they had limited or possibly limited catheter wire experience, unlike the cardiologists. And we had the interventional neuroradiologists and radiologists who had significant catheter and wire experiences, but not necessarily in the carotids. And what the FDA wanted to assure is that if they approved this device in patients who were at high risk of stroke, how could they ensure that the clinicians who wanted to perform the procedure were safe to perform the procedure? And one of the proposals on the table by the professional societies, by the industry manufacturers, was that virtual reality simulation be used. But there was a significant debate between the professional societies and the FDA whether virtual reality simulation would be adequate for the task. And the fact was that the best virtual reality simulators, physics-based simulators, were in endovascular medicine. And so I was asked to advise the FDA, would simulation be an adequate support for clinicians who wanted to perform this procedure? And I presented the data that we had, over a number of years, particularly the VR to OR data that we'd completed in Yale and published in Annals of Surgery. And that tempered the debate significantly, because the FDA accepted that the scientific evidence was there that simulation-based training would be a very useful and powerful adjunct to help the clinicians acquire the procedure skills and experience to perform the procedure.
And when we speak about carotid stenting, Tony, it's a procedure where if something goes wrong during the learning curve, the patient can have a stroke or die on the table. So why was this the procedure that forced a conversation about how we train physicians?
I had just moved to Emory University in 2003 to take up a post as Director of Research in Surgery. And I asked the chief of the cath lab, who I work very closely with, Dr. Chris Cates, I said to him, what is it about carotid artery stenting that there's all this fuss about, whereas surgery, you have equally high-risk procedures. The simulators weren't as good, but the debate wasn't as fierce or as vibrant in surgery. He said, well, it's very simple, Tony. He says, if you're performing an endovascular procedure in the carotids and a patient strokes or dies on the table, he says there's no ambiguity about what had caused that, or there was minimal ambiguity. He said in surgery or other disciplines, or even in cardiology, if the patient starts to get sick after the procedure or they go to intensive care, and they subsequently die, was that the clinician that caused it? There's vagueness there. Was it the aftercare they got? Was it something that happened? Was it an act of God? He says, with the carotid artery stenting with embolic protection, if the patient strokes and dies on the table, there's little or no ambiguity as to who probably caused that stroke. And that was why it was such a high-profile procedure. And there was such concern by the manufacturers, by the scientific societies, and by the FDA. The debate about who should do it and who shouldn't do it was quite fierce.
And this paper points out that carotid stenting crosses multiple specialties, as you've already covered. So it covers vascular surgeons, cardiologists, and interventional radiologists. And each brings a different skill set. You argued that proficiency-based progression training eliminates the turf war. How?
Yeah, you're quite right. There was a fierce debate between the different scientific societies, cardiology, vascular surgery, and the radiologists. And they rightly claimed and stood on the clinical experience and the skills that they brought to the carotid artery stenting procedure. And to be frank, the FDA really didn't know where they stood. And when they were talking about procedure volume and so on for credentialing, uh, they basically wanted reassurance. The FDA wanted reassurance that the clinicians would actually have the skill set. And what the proficiency-based progression simulation training demonstrated to the FDA was, rather than actual procedure volume, procedure experience, historical skills that the clinicians brought, credentialing should be based on the skills that the clinician demonstrated. And that meant it leveled the playing field. It didn't really matter if you're a vascular surgeon or an interventional cardiologist or an interventional radiologist. You had to demonstrate proficiency on the simulator before you could advance to performing procedures on real patients.
Okay. And so the FDA panel voted to accept VR simulation as a component of the training package for carotid stenting. That's a regulatory body saying we will not approve this device unless the training methodology meets a standard. Had that ever happened before in medicine?
No, I mean, the closest that it came to it would have been the approval of surgical robotics back in about 2000. But I recognized immediately this was a big deal when the FDA approved it. Because, as I said, there was fierce debate. The simulators were good enough, and what the FDA were saying to the scientific societies and to the device manufacturers, you've got to use this as part of your credentialing process. Because one of the issues that the industry had and the scientific societies had was, if you haven't really performed this procedure before in the carotids, I mean, how are you going to meet a particular procedure volume? And there needed to be some way to prepare the clinicians as optimally as possible to perform the procedure given the risk. I mean, the risk even for a coronary angiography, is about 1%. That's just for a diagnostic procedure. And for an interventional procedure, it's even higher. And so what the FDA did was they set precedent by saying to the industry and to the scientific societies, yes, you can do the procedure, but you're going to have to demonstrate the skill set, that you're safe to perform the procedure.
Okay. And in the article, you describe a traditional assumption. If a physician performs a procedure a certain way a number of times, they become proficient. You call that a crude surrogate, but it's still how most credentialing works. Why does that persist?
Yes, that's a good question. Why does that persist? Because the evidence is now clear that the volume of procedures that a clinician does a year, the number of career procedures that they've done, really is a very crude indicator of the skill level of the clinician. And the FDA decision, it leveled the field at that. This approach still persists, but the reason we published the paper in JAMA was to describe, there's no data on it. It basically describes the sequence of events, because what we believed that we were witnessing was something historic, that you had a government body, and a very powerful government body, saying to the industry and to the scientific societies, you must train on the simulator to a performance benchmark before you can proceed and do this procedure. On top of that, what the FDA accepted was that traditionally they had counted the number of procedures somebody had done. They said that the simulated cases, the physics-based virtual reality simulation cases, would be a surrogate for a proportion of the procedures required for credentialing to do this procedure. So, I mean, we believe, Chris Cates and I at the time, we believed it was historic. It was the first.
Mm-hmm. And this was published in JAMA, not a surgical journal, not a simulation journal. Why did it matter that this argument appeared in a general medical journal?
Because I think it is important that this article appeared in a general medical journal, and a very high impact general medical journal, because the editorial board recognized that this wasn't just about an endovascular procedure. It wasn't just about carotid artery stenting with embolic protection. The scientific principles that we had advocated had been accepted by the FDA, and it was going to impact in all of procedure-based medicine, and not just procedure-based medicine, probably wider afield than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was like a decade or more later before we actually applied the PBP principles to communication skills. But when we did, we saw the same magnitude of improvement between the traditional trained and the proficiency-based progression trained. And I thought it was a very brave decision of JAMA, to be quite frank with you, because it was so profound, what we were saying, and it was so broad-reaching. But I suppose that's what the high-impact journals, that's their function, to get information like that out there and to pose a question to the rest of medicine, not just surgery. Because most of the work had been done in surgery. I mean, all the evidence that I brought to the FDA had all been collected in surgery. So it was a profound statement by a high-impact journal that, something different was coming down the tracks.
And speaking to that then, you end this paper by saying that physicians performing a procedure on patients for the first time will have to have a more homogeneous skill set. That word homogeneous is doing a lot of work. What does it actually mean for patient safety?
Homogeneous means, well, in my mind, homogeneous skill set means that they're uniformly good at doing the procedure or well prepared to do this procedure, and not uniformly not very good at doing the procedure, which is probably maybe what we see today. And I am surprised that this approach hasn't been accepted more, particularly by industry. Industry releases new devices onto the market. They set up, and it costs them a fortune to set up, instruction for use information, basic device training. And what we see at the end of the training is that a significant number of the clinicians are not particularly good at using that device. The implication is if they're not particularly good at using that device, they're going to not be particularly safe doing that procedure in a clinician or in a patient, but they do progress to performing it in patients. And what we see at the start of the rollout of new devices or a new procedure is, particularly for the devices, we see a high failure rate. And the clinicians would say that was the device. But as I now know, is devices such as pacemakers or CRT devices that are supposed to have failed, when the manufacturer takes them back to their plant and they dismantle them, they find out there was nothing wrong with the device. The implication was it must have been something to do with the implanter. And for many years, the implanters had denied there was anything to do with them. Data over the last 5 to 10 years basically demonstrates, number one, there's a very heterogeneous skill set of the clinicians who are using devices. I'm not just talking about cardiology now, I'm talking across the board. And that heterogeneous skill set is associated with a higher risk of device failure or bad outcomes for the patient. And what proficiency-based progression tries to do, or does, I would argue, is it better prepares the clinicians to use the device on real patients for the first time. Because one, they know how to do the procedure. They don't even get to the skills lab if they don't know how to do the procedure. That's why they have to pass the online didactic. And two, they're trained in the skills lab to perform the device, to perform the procedure and use the device. And it's not just perform it. They've got to perform it to a certain performance benchmark that is based on the mean performance of the experienced practitioners. And as somebody pointed out to me 25 years ago, Tony, that's an awful high bar for them to set. For them to pass, they've got to demonstrate that they're better than 50% of the clinicians you benchmark on. I said, that's right. For a few years, that concerned me. It doesn't concern me today because the clinicians demonstrate repeatedly that all of them, or the vast majority, can jump those bars. And it certainly has profound implications for patient safety. The small number of studies that we have that compare proficiency-based progression training in comparison to traditional training, traditional quality assured training, demonstrates that the patients have a better outcome. And that's not a minor detail.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Tony. So, Tony, the study we're talking about now is called the Copernicus Initiative, named after the man who proved that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. That's a bold name for a training study. What was the paradigm shift you were trying to demonstrate?
The paradigm shift we were trying to demonstrate was that there was a different way of training. Dr. Rick Angelo, who was the president-elect of the Arthroscopic Association of North America, they basically were building a new center in Chicago, a new orthopedic learning center. And I think the total center cost them about $60 million. This is like in 2012, 2013. But one of the questions that the arthroscopists asked was their training good enough? Was there something better? We're putting all this money into a building and we're assuming that their approach to training was sufficient. Now, don't get me wrong, they were actually being good scientists. The Arthroscopic Association of North America were immensely proud of the center that they had built. They were immensely proud of their training, and it was seen as an honor to be invited to be a trainer or faculty on the courses. So when we started out to do this trial, the assumption was that ANA was going to be at least as good or better than anything else that we offered. But what they wanted to know was, okay, did simulation have a role to play in this new simulation center? And if it did have a role, what was it? And there was a suspicion that simulation would augment their approach to training, but they weren't prepared for the results that actually were generated from the study.
And with this study, Tony, you had 3 groups: traditional training, simulator training, and proficiency-based progression plus simulator. The simulator-only group was barely better than the traditional. Why doesn't just giving people a simulator work?
Yes, the simulator trained group in the Copernicus study, I think, surprised all of us. The results, I think, the group that performed worst were the traditional ANA trained group, and the ANA, or as an organization, were shocked by that. But even I thought that adding a simulator to that training would improve it considerably. It actually only improved it by about 3 or 4%. And the proficiency-based progression group had the exact same curriculum as the simulator train group. All of them had the traditional ANA curriculum. The simulator train group had the opportunity to practice on a simulator, and the PBP train group, not only did they have the same curriculum as the simulator train group, they had to test the proficiency on everything. They had to test the proficiency on the online didactic. They had to test the proficiency on the suturing, the knot tying, and the surgical models before they were allowed to progress. Now, the 3 groups had the same period of training. They flew into Chicago on a Friday evening, they left on a Sunday evening. So time and training wasn't the issue. What they had to train on, the curriculum, simulation devices, wasn't even the major predictor of how well somebody did. It was the metrics applied to the curriculum. And the lesson that I walked away from that study was, okay, just having fabulous facilities, also having simulation in the course, it means very little unless you actually have the metrics to drive the learning and you set proficiency benchmarks. Remember, the individuals who go into surgery or medicine, and not only are they smart and they're motivated and they're hardworking, they're also competitive. And if you tell them, okay, this is the benchmark you've got to reach, by and large, the majority of them will work very hard to get there. And 75% of the PBP group, PBP trained group, demonstrated the proficiency benchmark. Had we had another half day or a day, we probably would have got everybody to proficiency. There was one individual I'm not sure about, but the rest of them, I'm pretty sure we would have got to proficiency.
Okay. As you say, this is a particular cohort there, but I think it's safe to say that in most industries, barring the sociopathic few, no one wants to deliberately do a bad job. Everyone is trying to do their work to the best of their ability. But back to the study, the proficiency-based progression training group made 56% fewer errors than the traditional training group. But the number I keep coming back to is that the residents who met every intermediate proficiency benchmark were 7.5 times more likely to achieve the final standard. What does that 7.5 number actually mean?
The 7.5 number actually means that the proficiency-based progression train group were significantly better than the ANA train group and significantly better than the group that had the simulation. It meant that they were better at the procedure, they were safer at the procedure. And we know that if you are safe, if you're performing well by the end of the course, you're almost certainly going to be safer in the operating room or whatever the task is that you're wanting to do. One of the important things about the ANA study, actually a number of important things. One, it was the first study led by a scientific society and funded by a scientific society, and they were genuinely interested in what the outcome was. Two, it was the first study that used proficiency demonstration as an endpoint. Prior to that, what we had been doing is we had trained individuals to the proficiency benchmark, and we really only reported the scores, their steps, errors, critical errors, how long they took, and so on. The ANA study was the first to use the proficiency benchmark as an outcome measure. What percentage of them did? And when Rick Ansel asked me, how many do you think will reach the bench? I honestly didn't know. And the question about, can we get everybody to proficiency has remained unanswered until the last few years with Stefano Pogliatti's study, where he demonstrated, we can get everybody to proficiency and using the proficiency-based progression training paradigm and complete, we can get everyone to proficiency fastest. It's the fastest, it's the most efficient, it's the most economic, you get the best quality outcomes, and it costs less. By a country mile, it costs less.
For sure. And back to the Copernicus study for a second, if I may. So you mentioned already the 25% of the proficiency-based progression group who couldn't meet the intermediate benchmarks during the study weekend. Under a strict proficiency-based progression protocol, they wouldn't have been allowed to progress. That's a quarter of the trainees. How do training programs and the people running them deal with that reality?
Individuals not demonstrating the proficiency benchmark on the standard training course, that's an issue, and it's one of the issues that the standard training courses are going to have to overcome. The way that I would normally advocate that training should be done, there should be a simulation room in the hospital or in the medical school where the trainees can go to for a few hours a week or a half a day a week, and they continue training until they demonstrate the proficiency benchmark. That approach is called distributed training. And in a paper in Annals of Surgery quite a few years ago, we demonstrated by a country mile that that's the most efficient way to train somebody. The reality is that the simulators are so expensive for this, particularly for the endovascular type procedures and the robotic type procedures, that you just can't probably afford to have those simulators spread throughout every hospital in the country. And something's going to have to be worked out to allow that 25% to reschedule and to come back to finish their training. Because what Stefano Pogliatti's data has demonstrated is that we can get everyone to proficiency. And subsequent evidence from the Arthroscopic Association of North America, when they were considering the cost of rolling out, a proficiency-based progression course, what they were saying was that economically, it's hard to argue we can only do one procedure on a course. So they did two procedures. And what they demonstrated was they can get about 90% of them to proficiency. There's still going to have to be a way to help those individuals who didn't pass to get to proficiency. Now, there'll be a line drawn on the sand somewhere, but we don't know where that's going to be because training is quite expensive, particularly in the skills lab. But the opposite of that, the opposite side of that coin is to get somebody to that level. They've gone through medical school, they've gone through residency, or they're going through residency, and that's a very expensive just to say to somebody, no, you can't progress. You need to be fairly certain that this individual is not going to be able to acquire the skills. And the evidence suggests that we can get the vast majority, if not all of them, to the proficiency benchmark. Now, I'm not saying all of them are going to be, rock stars, but they're going to be good, safe clinicians, that we know are safe to perform the procedure. And for my money, I'm happy with that there. I don't need a rock star. What I need is somebody that's good at the procedure, that's safe to do the procedure, and I'm happy about them doing the procedure on me, a member of my family, or my child, or my friend.
Mhm. And with the Copernicus study, Tony, before anyone touched a simulator or a cadaver, you required the PBP group to pass a cognitive exam on the steps and errors of the procedure. Why does that matter so much?
Requiring someone to pass the online learning, the didactic, before they get to the skills lab, it's important because it makes training in the skills lab more efficient and more effective. If somebody turns up to the skills lab and they know nothing about the procedure, you're tied to the person that knows least, and
Mm.
that is a waste of resources. And what we did in the Copernicus study, it was actually one of the first times we did it. We basically said to the trainees, if you don't pass the online didactic, you're not getting to the skills lab. We use that all the time now. And what we've found is that if you require somebody to pass the proficiency benchmark on on the online didactic before they get to the skills lab, it has a huge impact in how quickly you can get them to proficiency and how well they actually perform. Because they're not just learning how to do the procedure, they already know how to do the procedure. They've never done it on a simulation or an animal or whatever. And we found that it makes them more receptive to learning, it accelerates their learning curve enormously because they're concentrating on the technical delivery of what they've learned. And I mean, I don't do a simulation-based course now unless the trainees actually demonstrate the proficiency benchmark on the online didactic. I mean, it's just non-negotiable.
And for the metrics, you broke an arthroscopic bankart repair down into 45 steps and 77 potential errors. That level of task deconstruction must have taken enormous effort. Why can't you train to proficiency without it?
The metrics are the building blocks and foundations of any effective training course. Otherwise, what you have is faculty turning up and using their experience of doing the procedure to train the trainees. And you have a very heterogeneous approach to performing the procedure. The reason that we developed the metrics before the course was we needed to identify a standard or reference approach to performing the procedure. And anybody teaching ANA trainees, they had to know what these metrics were. I mean, at Delphi, for example, we said to the attendings who turned up to scrutinize the metrics, this may not be the approach that you would use in your practice, but what we're identifying is not wrong. And what we did, we identified the steps for a straightforward approach to the procedure on an uncomplicated patient. This is what you should do. These are the instruments that you should use in what order. These are the errors that you shouldn't make. Now, the errors is still a fundamental problem for procedure-based medicine. They think of an error as a critical error, whereas we think of an error as a deviation from optimal performance. A critical error is a deviation from optimal performance that either compromises whether you can complete the procedure or not, or compromises patient safety. In this study, the ANA study, there was an argument about whether they would use critical errors or sentinel errors. What one of the metrics groups said to me, well, if we don't do a good procedure in your arm, in your shoulder, you may never use your arm correctly again, but you're gonna live. If somebody working in the cardiovascular system or in the neurovascular system, they do something wrong, it's probably going to have fatal and catastrophic results. So the critical errors in the ANA study are actually called sentinel errors. Now, that division is important. One of the things that we've subsequently learned is, yes, if a critical error is enacted, there's a high probability something bad's going to happen from it. An error, a deviation from optimal performance, is where you're looking at somebody doing the procedure and you go, you probably shouldn't have done that. Whereas a critical error is, what the hell were you doing?
Mm.
What we've discovered after the ANA study is that the errors are a better predictor of bad outcomes. And what we think is happening is that an error, a deviation from optimal performance, the vast majority of the time nothing significantly bad happens. But each error that the clinician enacts sets the occasion for that event to cascade. And it cascades into something more catastrophic. And so therefore, the errors are a better predictor of patient outcomes. Surgeons who are making more errors are more likely to have a bad outcome than surgeons who are making critical errors. That's not to diminish the importance of enacting critical errors. But one of the other things we've learned is that clinicians seem to learn to do the steps, and they learn not to make critical errors. They seem to be less concerned about what they would call minor errors or deviations from optimal performance. What I'm saying in proficiency-based progression training, you should make as few errors and as absolutely few critical errors as possible. And it's the error performance that we really have to train them to be cognizant of, and what leads to it, because they're more likely to lead to a bad outcome because they're so frequent.
We've spoken about some of this already, but this study distinguishes between errors and sentinel errors, the ones that could compromise the procedure or cause serious harm to the patient. Why is that distinction important for how you design training?
The trainees understand that critical errors are more likely to lead to some catastrophic outcome. What they're less sensitized to do is the errors. The steps, they know if they don't complete the steps, they're not completing the procedure, and that's non-negotiable. But what the trainees are less sensitized to is the importance of the errors. And we really only confirmed that in the study from Martini Clinic in the last few years. And it wasn't that we were shocked by it, but certainly we were surprised by it. We were looking at the robot-assisted radical prostatectomy performance of surgeons, expert surgeons in the Martini Clinic, who had a high volume of robotic-assisted radical prostatectomies per year, like 2,600 cases a year. And so these weren't trainees, these were consultants. And what the data showed is we were looking at patients who had the exact same profile before surgery. They were approximately the same age, they were same state of disease, and so on. And we matched
same demographic data, same clinical data.
Same. I mean, there was no significant differences between the patients. And we selected, it wasn't prospective randomized. We matched the patients so that they had the same demographic and clinical profile before surgery, but after surgery, approximately half of them were impotent and incontinent, and the other half were potent incontinent. And we asked, okay, what distinguishes or what's associated with the outcomes from these two groups of patients? Because they were performed by the same surgeon. And the medical profile didn't distinguish. What did distinguish, the procedure steps didn't distinguish between the outcomes. The errors did. The errors was something like 60% difference. Patients who had a bad outcome, who were impotent and incontinent post-surgery, like at 1 year, they had 60% more errors, intraoperative errors, than the patients who were potent and continent. And there was no difference in the critical errors. I mean, there was a small difference. It was tiny, like 3-4%. Patients who had a bad outcome had 3 or 4% more critical errors. Where the largest difference was patients who had more errors during the neurovascular bundle dissection phases of the procedure were significantly more likely to have a bad outcome. There were more errors. I mean, and it was like 70-odd%. And there was some surprise at the results, but the data, they were very robust in terms of the assessments of the videos, in terms of the workup of the patients, in terms of the follow-up of the patients. So what we can confidently conclude is that the critical errors occur so infrequently that they're a poor predictor of outcome. Yes, the critical errors are important, but the trainees seem to learn quickly. Without the steps of the procedure, you don't have a procedure, so you've got to complete all or the majority of the procedure steps. The critical errors, they're very sensitized to not making critical errors because they know they're more likely to have a catastrophic outcome. What they're less sensitive to is that the errors, the majority of the time, nothing happens that doesn't have any negative consequences. But the more often you make an error, it sets the occasion for that event to cascade, and that's what's more likely to lead to a bad outcome. And so there's going to have to be a reframing of the thinking of how we inform trainees, and we sensitize them to the performance errors.
We also need to overcome the hesitancy in some organizations which don't want to teach errors because they're afraid that were they to teach errors, that the trainees would take that into standard practice almost by osmosis.
No.
And we've had those conversations with some training providers, Tony.
Yeah. I mean, on the contrary, I mean, informing trainees about potential errors that they can make doesn't mean that they'll bring it into clinical practice. You're informing them that, number one, you shouldn't do this. Number two, when you train them and you score them on it, and you give them that, you're not giving them that feedback simply because you're giving them an assessment. You're giving them feedback that these are the errors that you made. Why do you think you made those? Did you not know that you shouldn't do that? And it's that formative feedback that drives the learning curve. Because we've been very good at teaching the trainees what steps to do and what critical errors not to make. But the errors, the deviations from optimal performance, we've got to do better on that. And that the organizations that are concerned about teaching trainees about the errors, I mean, to put it bluntly, they're wrong. We learn more from making mistakes than we do from getting it right. And that's a scientific principle, and it's been established, for the best part of 3/4 of a century in any domain.
So when we speak a little bit to the model that was used for a moment in the Copernicus study, you used a medium fidelity physical shoulder model, not a high-end virtual reality simulator. You've said before that fidelity isn't the point. So what is?
Yes, fidelity in simulation-based training is not the point. The point is that the simulation that you choose should be capable of allowing the trainee to perform either a phase or crucial steps or crucial phases of the procedure, that you can observe them, but you can also give them feedback on their performance. It allows them to complete, for example, full procedure in what we used in the Copernicus study. We had a silicon shoulder model. They could perform the entire procedure, from the skin incision to the port placement, to the arthroscopic assessment, to the drilling and placement of the anchors, to the suturing and knot tying. Ideally, I mean, if I had a wish that I could magic something tomorrow morning, it would be that all of the surgical procedures, we would have a physics-based virtual reality simulation that would give the trainee objective assessment on an ongoing basis. I mean, we have that in endovascular procedures. But if you don't have that, there's no point in wishing your life away. You really have to use what you have. You do what you can with what you have where you are. In the Arthroscopic Association of North America, in their orthopedic learning center in Chicago, we went to the cupboard, literally. We went to their cupboard and we said, what have you? They had the silicon shoulder model and they had the cadaver shoulder model, or cadaver shoulder. And that's what we used. And we developed the metrics first before we started looking at what simulation. And we knew that the silicon shoulder model, it wasn't perfect, but it would do the job. We wanted to train the trainees to be able to tie sutures and knots that would hold. And we developed a tensiometer specifically for the job. And the cadaver shoulder is what they would train on normally. And all three groups had the exact same access to the exact same simulations. And the difference was like night and day. So it's not what you have, it's what you do with it. And it's the metrics that affords a curriculum on a simulation. So you develop the metrics first, and then you say, okay, what models or what simulations will best allow me to train a trainee to do the procedure? And the procedure, it doesn't have to be the procedure. Okay, you want something that's going to train them on the procedure. But one of the things that we've learned is we do the construct validity when we've, as part of the validation of the metrics. and
Mhm.
want to know, okay, do the metrics distinguish between experts and the objectively assessed performance of experts and novices? Okay. But we also see is some phases of the procedure, the difference is much greater than other phases. Those are the phases that the trainees struggle to perform or struggle to learn. So in a curriculum, you need to emphasize those phases of the procedure. And a part-task trainer is just fine. I mean, the tensiometer and some models for suturing and knot tying in the that was a single task, but it was a crucial task. When we did the construct validity, what we learned was, I mean, there were other aspects of the procedure. We thought it was going to be drilling and anchor placement were the biggest. It wasn't. It was suturing and knot tying. So we went away and we developed something bespoke for the training and assessment of arthroscopic suturing and knot tying. The metrics, yes, they inform everything, but what the validation studies inform us is, okay, where do you need to concentrate your training? Because this is where the trainees have the most difficulty. And so the fidelity of the simulation it's informed by the metrics, it's informed by the validation evidence on the metrics, and it's part of a holistic curriculum from online learning to learning the procedure and difficult parts of the procedure. But you have to assess, you also have to be able to assess, and not online's relatively straightforward because you have a captive audience that are at their computer working on it. In the skills lab, it's more challenging. So you need either automatic assessment from the simulator, or you need somebody standing at their shoulder assessing their performance and giving them formative feedback as the training progresses.
So, Tony, despite all the training taking place in Chicago, this was a multi-site study. You had 44 residents from 21 different programs across the United States, with faculty equally dispersed. Why was it important that this wasn't just one enthusiastic center producing the results?
Yeah, the ANA study is important for so many reasons. I mean, the fact that it was led by a scientific society, the fact that they used proficiency as an outcome measure, but it was also important because this was the largest prospective randomized and blinded study of its type conducted. They had, as you said, residents from 21 sites across the United States. These were all ACGME approved orthopedic residency programs. They were flown into Chicago and they were trained and assessed in Chicago. And so that heterogeneous cohort of residents, because we had no idea what the performance levels of the trainees coming into Chicago was going to be like. The faculty were from across the United States. Okay, we trained the faculty, Dr. Rick Angelo and I trained them. One, they had to know the metrics if they wanted to be the faculty. Number two, we trained them how to interpret the metrics, not just for the assessment. They had to understand when a particular metric, what it meant, and then they had to demonstrate that they could score it reliably. And they also had to demonstrate that they could give a trainee explicit, constructive, formative feedback in a pleasant manner rather than in an authoritarian manner. That doesn't sound, particularly important, but that's what drives the proficiency-based progression. Is the trainees not having to guess? You didn't do very well there. They don't have to guess with PBP. What didn't do very well. I mean, we'll tell them precisely what they did right and what they did wrong, and we'll explain to them why we think. We'll ask them why they thought they were doing something wrong, but then we'll explain to them why we think they were doing something wrong, and then we'll show them how to fix that. And
it's a huge advantage of the metrics being binary and observable.
Yes.
You can give that level of feedback, whereas if it was a Likert scale and a 1 to 5, how well was this done? It becomes very subjective and difficult to use for formative feedback.
Yeah, but it was also standardized. Because you must remember that those faculty were bringing their own clinical experiences, their own approach to performing the procedure. And had we not standardized it, I mean, the results would have been quite different, I suspect. But we did standardize it, and it wasn't just the curriculum we standardized how the attendings delivered the metric-based feedback to the trainee. We standardized their evaluation, and as the inter-rater reliability demonstrates, the percentage of agreement was huge for that study. And you have to remember, the students were from all over the United States, as were the faculty from all over the United States. And yet they produced such a coherent and very powerful result. There's so many novel things about the Copernicus study. And I think it was a seminal moment in the development of the evidence supporting a proficiency-based progression approach to training.
And Tony, the Copernicus study concludes that it's the metrics-dependent PBP curriculum coupled with the simulator that makes the difference, not the simulator on its own. If an organization came to you tomorrow with a training problem, where would you tell them to start?
If an organization came to me tomorrow, I would tell them to start with the metrics and to identify individuals that are good at the job and that you could work with, that are reasonable to work with. And I'd try and identify probably 3 of those individuals, develop the metrics, validate the metrics, and then say, okay, what do we need to build? What simulations do we need to build a curriculum that would produce trainees that can demonstrate the proficiency benchmark by the end of training?
Fantastic study, Tony, and thanks for bringing us through it. And that's the Copernicus study, everybody.